there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. So, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the recent gleeful, boasting reaction by certain anti-woke outrage merchants here on the interwebs surrounding the recent box office failure of the MCU's recent movie, The Marvels. And I want to do this not just to do the normal thing of poking fun at them at being like, oh, look, they're always going to be sexist and racist and ranting about, look, there's women in a movie, oh, we must hate it. That is something I'm going to talk about and is a part of what I'm going to discuss. But I think it goes a little bit deeper in terms of the specific reaction to this movie that I've seen that reveals a lot more about the depth of how these people view movies and storytelling generally and how they wish it to constantly be catered to them and shoved down their throats in a way that doesn't challenge them or giving them something intriguing to think about. So to give a brief little context to all of this, as many of us know, the recent MCU film The Marvels came out featuring 3 women leads, namely Brie Larson in the Captain Marvel role, sort of returning to that, and it was a big box office disappointment, earning, I believe, the lowest opening for any Marvel project whatsoever. And, if I was to sort of sit here and analyze why that's the case, I think it comes down to numerous different factors. I mean, there's obviously been the larger cooling off of Marvel stuff lately with a general dip in quality, though I think things like, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 showcase that that's not a completely true rule, but overall the trend has been very much downwards, with the last major project, Ant-Man Quantumania, being a huge critical and commercial failure, as well as the oversaturation of the MCU generally with the TV shows, as well as the Marvels also being a movie that, at least on the surface, seems like you need to do the most homework to get into, considering that 2 of its leads were introduced in TV shows, as well as there being Secret Invasion leading up to it, nominally, even though I think it's better to have not seen Secret Invasion going into the Marvels, as well as just the general feeling of like you need to have seen all the Marvel movies going into this movie as well. And then on top of that, I do think that there is a level of sexism in terms of, how people are talking about the movie. I mean, there's the most overt thing. There are certain men out there who will not show up for a female-led film, but I even think it goes deeper than that, with there being a lot of like extra scrutiny on the film because it's women in the center role, and so there's sort of this sense of uniqueness that is, again, whenever you see a movie with minority folks in the lead role, there's always this extra sort of level of like, it needs to hold the weight of, representing all these people on top of it, and that we've seen that even come out in some of the discussion around the film, with the director of the movie getting a lot of criticism for having left the post-production early because she had another project to work on and it was delayed for a very long time, which is, not always a good thing. I'm not going to say it's a great thing that happened during the creative process. Ideally, a director would stay on during the post-production process, but that is a somewhat normal thing in blockbuster Hollywood, with many male directors doing the exact same thing when they have to go to another project and sort of leave off post-production to the studio to finish off and them sort of checking in. But when it's a woman director, it sort of becomes the larger conversation around her because, again, the added scrutiny, not overt like, haha, we're going to criticize a woman more, just more like it's a women project, so people are going to be focused on it more, and there being a level of sexism and also, racism in terms of how that is looked at. So again, I think there's this huge confluence of factors that, again, I do think like some level of sexism or racism in both systemic ways and also very overt and bigoted ways as well play into that. But it is numerous different things that I think I would even chalk up more to the larger systemic problem of Hollywood in the MCU in this moment. You can also even talk about the fact that the actors weren't even allowed to promote the film, given that it was going on during the SAG-AFTRA strike when this sort of movie was doing its sort of normal lead into promotion. But of course, whenever there is a female-led film, especially against these sort of Disney properties that the anti-woke brigade likes to rail against because of woke Disney, brands shoving women and queer people down our throats, like to say, is that they sort of take this narrative and be like, oh, look, it's because women were, taking over the MCU and things like that, to sort of peddle this outrage to get clicks on their platform because rage sells clicks. And again, this is not something new, but one of the most prominent voices that sort of entered this debate was Chris Gore, who I have not even thought about since he appeared on the original version of Attack of the Show years ago, but I guess is still apparently around, and he said this in a tweet.
Turning Marvel and Star Wars into girl brands will prove to be one of the costliest decisions in entertainment history.
And this tweet was kind of fascinating to me because it kind of revealed a lot of how these sort of outrage merchants think about these types of properties that they apparently care about, in that it ultimately reveals how they don't really care about these stories just being catered to and feel like they are being the only ones targeted. Because Chris Gore mentions that the worst thing that happened to Marvel and Star Wars is that they became girl brands. And this is just wild to me because, number one, how in the world has Marvel and Star Wars become girl brands in a larger sense? I mean, looking at Star Wars right now, yes, you had Rey being the sort of, main character of the, lead Star Wars production. But literally, Adam Driver is the person that got the most attention from those films. Like, both Rey, Johnny Boyega as well, they got, nothing. In fact, a lot of harassment from those films and haven't really gotten a ton of mainstream attention since. But even beyond that, if you look at the TV shows, yes, you have Ahsoka, but the biggest thing that came on the TV Star Wars end was Mandalorian in terms of, financial success, as well as critical success. You have Andor, which is also a nominally dude-focused show. And I say that as someone who loves Andor, and do think that it actually has a lot of really strong women within it, but it's sold as a male-focused show with the character of Cassian Andor. And if you look at Marvel, most of the products that they've been releasing lately are dude-centric, or at least ensemble-centric with dudes in the lead roles, like Guardians of the Galaxy. And even further, we can even think about how these women are placed within these stories, because while I would say something like Andor does have multifaceted women, if I look at something like Ahsoka or Rey as characters within Star Wars, or even Captain Marvel herself as well, though I think the Marvels opens it up a little bit more, but in the original Captain Marvel, this was definitely the case, these women don't really feel like they're written like women. They feel like they're just written as blank characters that have to be these stoic non-personalities for the most part that drive the narrative forward, and their perspective as women and their unique place as women within these stories and universes isn't really super centered. At times it is sort of tokenistically called to, like in Captain Marvel, where she says, "I don't need to listen to you," to what's-his-face, the villain of that film. Literally cannot even remember. Or you have moments in Star Wars where, Rey is, written as a woman in order to be placed as, this redemptive arc for Kylo Ren. So even then, her womanhood is made to prop up the male character. But in any way beyond that, I really feel like these women aren't really written as women, but just written as non-personalities that you could place sort of any type of character into: men, women, marginalized person, group, whatever, and just write them exactly the same way, because there's this idea that, there's this ubiquity of experience instead of actually writing these characters as full people with full unique perspectives on the world. And so it's these things aren't girl brands, they're just things that happen to have girls in them sometimes, but still ultimately are catered towards selling things on this sort of 4-quadrant or even more dude-focused market. But of course, the just presence of women in any way, shape, or form in some form of lead role in some aspect of the brand, be it the Marvels or Ahsoka, somehow makes these girl brands overall. And these folks like Chris Gore sort of seeing because there's an element that isn't fully catered to me, they've suddenly become a brand at all, not for me. And this brings me back to what Chris Gore said, that these things becoming girl brands are the worst thing that could have happened to these franchises, because it ultimately reveals something much deeper, in that he doesn't really care about these stories, and none of these people really care about the stories of these properties that they seemingly care so much about. They really just care about it being a product that is marketed towards them solely and only. They only see how these movies are proffered up into the marketplace around them as how they give a crap about the film. So when they see something that isn't just targeted solely at them as they have been in years past, they say, well, screw it, this isn't a thing for me. It has to be for girls or for minorities or for whatever. And instead of actually looking at the stories themselves and critiquing them beyond how they put their lens onto it about how it hates men or something like this. I mean, I look at something like Barbie, for example, which I have many criticisms of Barbie, but it's ridiculous to say that girl brands don't sell, number one, and number two, that movies like that aren't made for them. If I even make an argument, and I'm going to be making a video about Barbie, I look at the Barbie movie, and there's almost an aspect of this movie almost feels like it's more made for men to hear the message that Ken hears in the film about patriarchy being bad for also men. Ryan Gosling seems to be having the most fun in that movie, and actually has some of the biggest character arc in the film, arguably, and it seems to have the weight of the world on Barbie, and again, sort of placing her in this more role of having to be the symbol for so many things. And so, like, I look at something like Barbie, which is supposedly a woman-led film, and even has equally, if not more so, things to say to men. But because it's not branded as like this is a thing for men, they don't see that at all and just say it hates men because they don't really care about the stories of these universes. They just see them as products, and they only want the product to be sold to them, which is interesting considering that these companies like Disney and all these other companies that are just trying to sell movies only see these works of art as products as well. I mean, look at the things like David Zaslav shutting down movies like the recent John Cena film that James Gunn wrote that looked really interesting, and shelving it, as well as the Batgirl shelving and things like that, because they don't really see these things as works of art that need to get out there and say something. They just see them as products. So it's just this battle over, whether something is marketed towards, as many people as possible and as the most bland way as possible by doing tokenistic diversity like these brands want to do, or only catering it just towards men by only having white dudes in the lead roles of these films. It's just arguments over capital and product and exploitation of narratives rather than actually creating stories that are actually deeply meaningful and saying something to us. I mean, again, I have major criticisms of the Barbie movie. I think it actually has a lot of problems. Again, I'll be making a video on it. But like, part of the reason that it was so popular was not just because it was a movie for women and sold to women, is because it was a movie that seemed to, at the very least, have a message to say. It wasn't just blandly saying nothing, but there was at least a level of a message that Greta Gerwig wanted to say with the film, and she said it with her full chest. Again, I have criticisms, but something like that coming out in the blockbuster vein is still worthwhile accomplishment because most things don't have that vision. And that, I would argue, is why the movie did so well, because it felt like it said something. It felt like it was actually saying something, not just being a product. But again, these anti-woke outrage merchants are just fighting over capital. And you can look at that through all of right-wing politics, really, at this point, about how all they're fighting for really is just to be the centered market in everything, whether it be from, politics to housing to, medical stuff to, our stories that we tell in our art. They just want to be the center of the narrative. They don't really care what that narrative is, just that they get to be the center protagonist of it and get to be the lead, and everything around them is either pushed down, villainized, or seen as, background actors to them, not actual, depthful meaning about anything. So ultimately, the solution to this at the end of the day is to, I say, go out and find more stories and art that actually speak meaningfully. I look at something like Everything Everywhere All at Once that won Best Picture last year. Again, the reason that movie resonated was not because it has an Asian woman in the lead, but because it was a movie that had depth and thought and meaning and emotion behind it that used the perspective of the lead character being an Asian woman to tell that story and frame that story in a way that felt very specific, but that specificness made it universal because we could see the humanity within it. And that's what makes art good, and why things like the MCU and Star Wars generally have not been resonating with anybody, but also why people are arguing over it because they want to be centered as product.